most Germans, so you can, if there's questions, you can address the questions in German, and I might understand it. But my German speaking is very lousy, so I will try to understand it. Otherwise, I know Frank Baller here, he will be able to, if I may use you and your language skills, he can maybe translate it if I don't understand it. So, yeah, this is a speech about what I call Archer's reflex. And you probably know, all of you, the sentence about target panic or Schusspanik in German. I believe it's translated into that. And I have written 2 books about it, or 1 book, but it's translated into German and English by the Verlag Angelica Hönig. Angelica will be here in a minute. And I will talk about why this reflex, as I call it Archer's reflex, because all archers get this reflex, and it's a simple conditioned reflex that is created. And I will talk about why this is created and how we can suppress this reflex. And I think all archers, almost all archers, know this reflex in a lot of different manners. But as you see here, Schuss reflex, target panic, Archer's reflex, and how to decode it or reprogram it. That's the main part in this speech here. A short history about myself here. I've been shooting with not a traditional longbow, but yeah, it's fine. Just answer. I just started here, so I can keep the time. I have been shooting with the longbow, American flatbow, so-called, for about 25 years, until when I was a boy. And I've been shooting on the Danish 3D national team in the longbow division 8 times now. And I've been, I have got a 3rd place at the European Championship and so on. So a lot of my target of my archery experience is from the competition experience. And I usually go in the forest and stump shooting as well. I love that part, so I connect the nature and the shooting as well. In 2016, I dislocated this joint here between my sternum and my collarbone here, and it had this impact. So every time I got up in my draw, it dislocated and just jumped down here, and I had to squeeze it back again. And at this championship in Slovenia in 2016, it dislocated about 50 times or something like that. And every time I had to put it back in the right place again. And after that, I created what I at that time called target panic, because every time I got up here in my draw, I just released, and I couldn't hit literally anything. So I started to investigate what was written and what was around in the world about the target panic part. And I have a bachelor in psychology, and I'm a hypnotherapist as well, and I've been teaching in anatomy and physiology. And I started to read my own psychology books and physiology books, and I saw that that the way our brain was working actually created a simple conditioned reflex. And I took what I was told and what I have read in different books, and I started to see how can I go to the center of where this reflex actually are created and start to suppress it or reprogram it, and how can we do that? Because a reflex will create a memory path that will stay forever. So you need to build up a reflex that is stronger than the reflex that is actually showing itself alive when you're shooting. So that was my way into writing this book here. And I have written a couple of other books about archery technique and mental practice as well. But I found out that there is no quick fix to create a new reflex that is stronger than the old one. It's simply not possible. I have been reading, some of you might know Joel Turner, the American guy who have made this feather to nose technique and so on. And it just starts to build up a new reflex when you do these things. And I've just had some online coaching sessions with one of the best American longbow shooters. And one of his good friends is Joel Turner, and he worked with him. And he says this it doesn't work because I just create a new reflex. And then when I get the feather to the nose, I can't release, or I release before the feather touches the nose. So, and that was what I saw in Denmark and Sweden and Norway as well, with these people who actually was dealing with this process that he had done. So, it's not a quick fix. Instinctive archery, intuitive archery, it has many names. In my opinion, instinctive archery in the way we normally perceive it doesn't exist. Everybody aim. Some aim consciously, some aim subconsciously. But it's not possible to just watch at, just look at the target you want to hit and then erase everything else in the sight vision that you receive. And you can try to hold your hands up here and stare at one point, and you can move your fingers and you will see the fingers moving. So you can't just erase it and take it away. It will become a part of your picture that you see. As well as the arrow, when you get up in full draw, you watch the point you want to hit, but the arrow will remain in the bottom of your sight picture all the time. And if you give a so-called instinctive archer an arrow that is a little heavier or a little longer, shorter, whatever, but different from what he or she normally will shoot with, they can't hit the target. So they need the arrow they are used to shoot with to shoot or hit the target. So my point here is that if you are conscious about what you are doing, then you can be conscious about correcting your mistakes or correcting whatever is happening when you're shooting. And that's what I write here. If you don't know what you're doing, you can't correct it, and that's like in the whole scene of life. If you don't know what you're doing, it's quite difficult to correct it, even with your plan and your money. And the distinction between the conscious and the subconscious aiming is that we can remain conscious about something, but we have a level of subconsciousness that is just below the conscious part. It's called subliminal perception. It's just below, and if you just move your attention just a little, it will be conscious. Like your breathing, for example, now, when you're sitting here, you won't think about your breathing, but if you just move your attention, the breathing is very conscious. And you can feel your stomach move in and out in inhalations and exhalations and so on. And that's the subliminal perception. The same thing is happening when we are shooting, that we have this subliminal part in our aiming picture or sight picture. We might see the target we want to hit, and in the bottom of our sight picture, this arrow will be a part of your subliminal perception, You just have to switch your consciousness or switch your focus, then you can see the arrow. And suddenly, oh, you know how you are aiming. And when we are aiming, I just heard the Paderbow speech here, Dietmar's speech here, and he talked as well about split vision and gap shooting. And it was actually created, or not created, but it was put in words by the American archer Howard Hill, if you know him. And he was probably one of the best archers who ever have lived, I think. And he was very, very conscious and very explicit about that he was a target archer. He used the split vision and the gap shooting part. The split vision is the way we receive imprints in our eye and create two different visions with each eye. And when we're using these two different pictures, we can decide which one of them we will aim with. And the best part here will be to aim with the eye that is just above the arrow, because then the arrow will move in that direction when you see it. The gap shooting part is if you have the target point you want to hit, and you see in the lower part of your side picture the tip of your arrow. On different distances, this gap between the tip of the arrow and the point you want to hit, on different distances, this gap will differ. And then it will like locate your arrow in the horizontal, it's called horizontal part, and the split vision part will line it in the vertical part. And then you have actually a cross sight like a firearm. And you can be very accurate in that way of aiming. The next part is how do we store all these pictures that are created when we shoot. And I was reading or rereading some of my psychology books and fell over this American psychologist, Daniel Stern. And he had created a theory about how we store pictures or sensations, whatever, that are almost alike, because we can't remember like all these thousands of pictures we have created when we are shooting. So he called it, he said that we are storing all these pictures in our memory as an average of all these pictures. And he called it an RIG, it's called a representation of an internalized generalization. And it means that we are storing it like an average. So it led me to this part, that when we store all these images as an average, and the side picture becomes the trigger mechanism for our release, then if we see a picture that is not exactly the right one, but an average, it's not always that this picture will be the right one. And I'm a 3D archer, so we need to have different pictures of our side picture on different distances. And these pictures are stored like this average picture, and becomes a trigger mechanism. And our brain has this ability to optimize all the sequences that are created in our brain. So when we see something that just are about to look like the average side picture, it starts a reflex. And the reflex that is started is this conditioned-like reflex. And you see my drawing here of a very simple drawing of the brain, because there's a lot of other things going on in the brain. But this here is the headlines of what is going on when the reflex starts up. And I need to say that we only have to do a movement 28 times before it gets automatized. And that's not very many movements before the brain starts to make this automatized movements sequence. So that will say that we see this reflex also with new beginners in the archery part. But you see these red lines here. When we receive a visual input here, it goes to the visual cortex in the back part of our brain. And if it's a reflex, you know, if I have a glass here, for example, it just drops down, I might catch it before it's hit the ground, and I'm not conscious about that part. So that's actually a conditioned reflex. The trigger mechanism here is that I see it, and I react on it even before I start thinking about it. Does that make sense? Or if you drive a car, you hit the brakes if something happens. You don't need to think about hitting the brakes, because this reflex here goes to the visual cortex and to the cerebellum of the kind here in the Dutch or German, and then to our premotor cortex and motor cortex that send signals out to our body to react on it. That's the way it works when we start releasing too early or even can't get rid of the string when we're shooting. Some people have this, they can't release it. It's just like freeze. But the prefrontal cortex is where the conscious part of the brain are situated. Here we create conscious movements, we create conscious speech and so on. But this reflex here bypassed the conscious part. And scientists have shown by a lot of experiments that our conscious parts of the brain are almost exactly half a second delayed from our reflexes. It would say if we were going to, like the glass that dropped down here, if we are going to be conscious about catching that glass, it will hit the floor even before we start to create a movement to catch it. Or in the car, oh, there's coming a car, I need to brake, and we have crashed before. So it's quite a good reflex, this one here. But in archery, it's not a good reflex, because when we receive this average picture of our sight picture that works as a trigger mechanism for releasing the arrow, then it just goes very fast, and quite often we can't hit it because the brain optimizes this reflex. And then we plan when we're standing here and we want to hit, and whoa, I'm going to make the best shot in the world now. That's my plan, at least. And I get up here, and it goes off. And where went my plan? Well, it went like somewhere in this half second of delay, and the reflex just took over. What happens then when we are making all these strange movements? Probably some of you know when you have this reflex here, it's here, and then you do like this, or you shrink, or you do strange movements that are not planned, because normally you can like shoot pretty well. It's because the reflex signals goes to the motor cortex, and the conscious reflex or the conscious signals go to the motor cortex at the same time when we really try to focus and suppress this reflex. And then these two opposite directed signals will start to fight in the motor cortex. Release, hold, release, hold. And it's like you can't stretch an arm or bend the arm at the same time. So with these two different opposite directed movements that should be made, then it just get out in a strange movement that we can't control. And what worse is that, as I write here, if you get a little adrenaline in your body, then will this reflex part be increased quite a lot. And you know, probably you have, the one of you, all of you who have been competing in archery or whatever, you have this like adrenaline thing in the body. You are a little more tense. You're sweat maybe or something, and this adrenaline level that just maybe a little increased, or if you're going to an examination or something, the adrenaline level rises in the body, and it makes this reflex here goes haywire, and it becomes even harder to suppress it and control it. So how can we control this? As a hypnotherapist, I have dealt with some of these people who have the archer's reflex, and we have been like, we've gone very deep into the brain and seen what is going on, and we try to make new reflexes, new movements. And that is actually what I work with here with the TAB method. It's a kind of, you can call it a kind of self-hypnosis or visualization process, where every time you visualize something, you will micro-activate your muscles. And scientists have actually shown that people who are like, what's it called, make workouts or lift weights or something, if they visualize that they are practicing or lifting heavy weights, they increase the volume of their muscles without doing anything. Because they micro-activate the muscles, they create new memory pathways to these muscles. Golf players have made the same part, where a control group was visualizing, and they were new beginners, all of them, visualizing. They have seen some golf players, they're visualizing these movements where you hit the golf ball with the club. And then you had another group who was practicing for real. And after a month or so, these two groups were playing together. And the one group who hadn't ever touched a golf club before, they actually did better than these people who had practiced every day for a month, because they had a visualization program that was very a very tough visualization program, but it shows that we are able to create movements without doing them. So when we visualize with this TAB method, it's called target anchor back, and it's a visualization that's where we watch the arrow before it hit, even before we have shot the arrow. The arrow sits at the target. We visualize our anchor point, and we visualize the release, the back tension. And that's the TAB method. When we work with this here, we need to change our mindset. We need to shift our mindset from a negative mindset, because the negative mindset will always like repeat itself. It will like be a self-fulfilling prophecy when we have this mindset that is negative in this area or whatever area you are using it for. And we need to create a curious mindset as well. A curious mindset is always a positive mindset, because you enter these problems with curiosity, and you try to see, hey, what is going on, and how can I deal with it? So a curious mindset is very important here. And you need to identify what actually is going on. Am I holding the string, can't I release, or am I waving, or am I shrinking? Whatever is happening, do I just get up here and release the arrow? You have to be very specific about what is actually going on, because then you can start to analyze it afterwards to see, okay, that was where the trigger mechanism actually was setting in. Does it make sense? Super. And I was a little inspired by one of the Swedish archers with this time interval part. If you start to see your movements in time intervals, and I will get back to that part about the time intervals, but if you start to see your movements in a time interval, you start to be able to identify very specific where does this trigger mechanism set in. And that's a foundation for all archery. You need to create a very, very solid shooting cycle. If you don't have a solid shooting cycle that is the same from shot to shot, you don't know actually what you're doing. So you need to be aware of what am I doing and create this shooting cycle here. And you can create a mental anchor. As a hypnosis therapist, I know that we can, if we create what we call a mental anchor, then we can connect something specific, something very real, with a positive thought. And here it's, I'll get back to the mental anchor a little later here, but here is when you check your bow handle, hold your bow handle, you will create this mental anchor. So when you have the sensation of the bow handle in your hand, you will start thinking about the best shot you have ever made and the best release you have ever created. And that's a visualization and a kind of self-hypnosis process. The visualization of the TAB line as the picture here. You start to visualize the target, you start to visualize the arrow sitting in the exact spot that you want to hit. And you visualize, as I said before, you anchor points, you feel actually anchor points before you have your fingers in the anchor point. And you feel your muscles contract in the back muscles. You feel your upper arm and your forearm squeezing together. And if you try to think that tension in your back, you will be able to feel it. And sometimes even by thinking, you'll start to make micro movements, even by thinking about it. And practice without releasing with the TAB method. That's another way to disqualify this reflex here and suppress it. So when you start to get up in your shooting line here and anchor point, oh, that's my side picture. Now I would normally release, but I lower the string here. Then you start to gain some control over this side picture, and it's pretty damn hard to do actually, but it can be done when you start to be aware of these things here. And you can practice with the TAB specific, the TAB, the visualizing method and a voice over. And when I write a voice over here, then you say these things, target, anchor, back, or you can say it in German or Czech or whatever language you are talking, it doesn't matter. Because when you activate your speech center in the brain, it overrules the reflexes a little. So if we start talking in ourselves, Super. When we start talking with ourselves inside our head, not like you know, the normal gossip or what are people thinking or whatever, all these things that are going on in the brain. It's not what I mean. It's a very specific voiceover that you need to make, like target, anchor, back. Then you suppress the reflex. These time intervals here are very crucial in this way of seeing it. And if you see, it's like a barcode when you're scanning things in a supermarket here. But right here, there's quite a span between the lines and the barcode. And the further you get here in the movement sequence, the closer these lines will become. And it means if I'm standing here, then I'm here in this time interval. Here I can decide without being triggered by this reflex at all. I can decide to go and have a cup of coffee, or I can raise my hand or whatever. There's no problem. I get closer and closer to the red zone. Joel Turner called it the storm, and that's very similar, but it's I call it the red zone here. I get up here, and I can still, in my pre-aiming process here, I can still decide to lower my bow. I get closer and closer up here, close to full draw, close to my side picture, and the closer I get to the side picture and my anchor point here, the closer I get to this part where the trigger mechanism actually sets in. And when the trigger mechanism sets in, I release. And it might be a good shot, it might not be a good shot, but it's normally out of control. And I would like to control my shooting. So I start to be very, very conscious about where exactly does this trigger mechanism sets in. And if I have my curious mind with me in that part, I start to make these lines wider. And suddenly, when I have done that a lot of time and been curious about how close can I get to the very point where the trigger mechanism sets in, the closer I get to that point and the more curious and conscious about this point I become, the further I can drag these lines away from each other. And suddenly I can control this part very, very close to the trigger mechanism sets in. And when I can control it until there I have the right side picture, and then let my reflex takes over, then I create a good shot, because almost all archers I have seen who create a solid shooting cycle, they have quite a good release as well. So if I can control the release until the very point where the side picture is right, and then let my reflexes take over, I create a good shot. The solid shooting cycle, and I'll just run very fast over this here. But I have these 5 basic skills in the way I see a solid shooting cycle, and there is a lot of there's a lot of points to each of these things here, or to each of these figures or stands here. The setup position that's taken from normal recurve aiming device or aiming shooters. They have their setup position here, but when we are shooting instinctively, or the way I see instinctive shooting, we create our setup position here, because that's where we start to move our body the right way. We feel the string, we push the bow into the hand, and when we lift the bow up here, we get up in a pre-aiming position. How the ill shooters, they would make a swing draw like this here. And it doesn't matter what you're doing, but I do this here, get up in the pre-aiming position here, because then I have already my sight pictures correctly in this pre-aiming position. So that's the setup position. That's the pre-aiming position here, where I start to look at the target, and I see my arrow already here, sitting exactly in the right spot where I want to hit. And I say target inside myself. The next is anchor. And as you see, I have written inhalation here. That's because I use my breathing as like chrono or like you know, these musician things where duck duck duck. What's it called?
Metronome.
Yeah, the metronome. Yeah, thank you. The metronome. I use my breathing for a metronome. So my breathing becomes that part that creates a rhythm in my shooting cycle. And when you are aware about your breathing, it's pretty hard to think about a lot of different things. So have your breathing with you. I make an inhalation here, exhalation, inhalation, hold it just a few, maybe half a second or 2 seconds, release the exhalation. So it becomes a rhythm in 2 full breathings in this way. A recurve shooter with aiming devices will, like a rifle shooter, maybe make a little exhalation here, but they have that clicker on the bow. If we start to make an exhalation here, we will collapse in the body, and that collapse will make us release like this. It's very too much I do here, but that will make us release like this normally. If we hold our breathing here, we can release like this here. So inhalation in the anchor point, and I say anchor. There. We make a little pause here. I start to focus on my backside, the back tension, and I focus on these 2 parts here squeezing together, because sometimes it can be pretty difficult to feel, especially if you are a little adrenaline full and you have this adrenaline kick for competition. The back tension can be extremely difficult to feel. But this part here is so much easier to have a sensation of. So if you start to have a sensation of this here and squeeze your upper arm and your forearm together, it will result in a tension in your back. And you can try it if you lift up here. You can feel when you squeeze your arm together here, you will make a firm release, and you will avoid also this waving here. So you say back to yourself, and you make a firm release like here. Exhalation. And that's the 5th part of this solid shooting cycle with the 5 basic skills there. And there's a lot of points where, so, as you can have your attention to. And I normally consider archery as a musician who is playing a piano or a violin, whatever, a guitar, and you will never ever experience a person being placed in front of a piano the first time ever and start to play Bach. And if you have heard one, I would be pleased to hear it. You will never ever hear such a thing. You will have to learn the keys on the piano and the right pressure on it, and you will need to learn to read the music. You will need to learn how to listen to the music and create all these parts that you practice and put them together before you actually are a good musician. And it's the same with archery. Before you actually can shoot and call yourself an instinctive shooter, you need to put all these small things together that you have been aware of in your practice, and that you have been consciously aware of in your practice. And when you are consciously aware of all these things here in your solid shooting cycle, you will know exactly where you make a mistake. It might be your stand, it might be your hip that is like not like twisted a little here, where you put your stomach muscles into the tension. You see a lot of archers who stand like this here, and their stomach muscles is not tense at all. They're not contracted at all. If you just bend your knees just a little, you're able to flip your hips like here, use your stomach muscle, and suddenly your stand will become very much more stable. So if you try to make a shooting cycle that is so like alike every time, so solid, then you can start to take off all the crap. You see people like going up here and down here, and Paderbow, he says that when we're shooting with longbow, we need to bend like this, but if you bend like this, you put your back muscles out of function, because you have a tension, and you can't control your stomach muscles suddenly when you do this here. So you need to take as much away, so you only have as few movements as possible in your shooting cycle. That's my opinion. The tap visualization, I have talked about that. You visualize the target, anchor, and the back part. And these are the keywords. And as right here, discipline and commitment are keywords, because you're not able to do this without practicing it. It's like, I don't know how many of you who runs a marathon, but I definitely don't do it, and if people ask me to run a marathon now, I would be able to run 2 kilometers and then I would be dead, probably. I need to practice it before, and we need to practice our brain. We need to train our brain doing this. The mental anchor, and I have on my YouTube channel a visualization that you can listen to with this mental anchor here. But as I said before, it creates a memory path from the physical sensation of the anchor or the handle to the good shot that you have made. Dry shooting is like dry swimming. You don't have your bow, but you start to make your stand here, feel the bow in the hand, lift the bow arm up, and when you lift the bow arm up, you almost lift the string arm up at the same time. You lift it up, anchor, release, and exhalation, and you've done the shot. And if you do this without a bow, you might well activate all your muscles, and you start to overrule the reflex, and you start to overrule all your bad habits when you are doing this here. So you will reprogram your brain in that way, and you can do it in the supermarket or when you're waiting at the bus. Maybe people will laugh a little, but this is Evgenia from the Russian national team, and she does it here, and shooting at a church or something. Yeah. So making it all work together here, analyzing the shot, how it works, the trigger mechanism, solid shooting cycle, become aware of the time intervals, the tap visualization before and in the shooting, the mental anchor, dry shooting. All these things brought together will start to reprogram the brain, and you will be able to control your shooting. And accepting, and that's a part of it, that it's a hard and focused work that you are going into. shooting every dry shot or every shot consciously. If you just start to like, oh, I'm just shooting today, I'm just having fun, then you will go back and your own program will start to take over again. And then you will have this fight in your brain the whole time. Discipline and commitment here. Whatever method you're using, commit yourself for that method. This is one method, but commit yourself to it. And don't go there and everywhere, because then you'll just, be very strange in your brain at the end, because there's so many things to work with. My YouTube channel, Jes Lysgaard here, and I have an email address here if somebody have answers or questions. Even if they have answers, that would be nice as well. The English book here, as I'm very pleased that Angelica have printed in her firm here, and there's a German version as well here, and you can buy it at the Verlag Angelica Hönig, and I have made one in Danish as well, but that might not be as good here. I've just written a new book in Danish, which have been published last week on the German publisher Books on Demand, and the Danish version, I hope it will be translated sometimes, but it's about this shooting, the technical part, and how to tune your bow and the arrows as well. So, yeah, I think that was the end of my speech here, and if you have questions, I will try to answer. And thank you for listening, and I hope you understood some of it. That's good. Super. And as